Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video lecture, we'll be covering coding PCS procedures for Chapter 8, the mental health chapter. Okay, the therapies that are involved in the behavioral health or mental health procedures, if you will, have codes either in one of two sections. The mental health section, which runs in the range of tables GZ1 through GZJ, and substance abuse, which fall into tables HC2 through HC9. The main terms you can use for these things in the index is the substance abuse treatment. And under the titles of various procedures, you'll also see some of them cross-listed as well. Some things that we look at in terms of root types, and root types again are those 6 characters, are the things that we look at as psychological tests, crisis intervention, medication management, and individual psychotherapy. We also here see things that we don't see so often: the electroconvulsive therapy, biofeedback, hypnosis, light therapy, and others. And again, here you see some of them. Again, this is table GZ1, but they all look kind of similar. And you'll notice it's the mental health section. We don't really deal with any second character because it's not relevant here. And then in 1, we're dealing with the third character. 1, when it pertains to mental health, is psychological test. Then we get into the other qualifier, which talks about what type of psychological test. Is it a developmental psychology test, personality behavioral, intellectual, neuropsychological, or whatever it is, right? And then we get over into the qualifier. There's none. There's no qualifier for the 6th character, and there's no qualifier for the 7th. Don't be alarmed if the last 3 characters of the codes in this chapter are all Z, Z, Z. And again, the table at GZ1 through GZJ, qualifier describes the root procedure, which we talked about, right? The root type, the type of psychotherapy, the type of counseling, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever it is, the different type of electroconvulsive therapy. And then the qualifiers, which, as we know, give an additional attribute to the procedure, really aren't relative here if you think about it. Substance abuse is a little bit different. Let's take a look at that table. That's HZ2. And again, with these, we see HC2, H for substance abuse treatment. Again, second character really isn't relevant here, right? 4th character, the qualifier. 5th character, also the qualifier. 6th and 7th. Let's focus on the 4th. That's where most of the confusion comes in with some of these. If you look over here, we have all the different types of behavioral therapy we have, counseling, if you will. We have cognitive, behavioral, 12-step, interpersonal, vocational, psychoeducation, motivational enhancement, all these things that are used in terms of substance abuse treatment, right? So again, once you get to the correct table for substance abuse, it's all fairly straightforward. And again, the qualifiers again talk about the specific root type procedure, the different type of individual counseling, very similar to what we saw with the mental health, right? in the GZ1 table, right? The different type of medication management, which is more of an issue with substance abuse. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Please reach out to me if you have any questions about any of this material. Bye now.